Welcome everybody to Monday Night Live. My name is Derek Arden, and today I'm delighted to introduce my friend Tim Durkin. Those of you that have seen Tim on the show before, you know that he's just full of tips, techniques and tactics that we can use in our lives, and from his life, which has absolutely been extraordinary. Welcome, Tim, back to Monday Night Live. Tim and I first met in Marco Island, Florida, 16 years ago, and we've been friends ever since. We have Zoom calls, we have chats, and we learn off each other because we're both lifelong learners, like everybody who joins Monday Night Live. But don't let that put you off. If you haven't joined Monday Night Live, please do join us. Let me tell you just a little bit about Tim. He was formerly a Marine when he left school, became very disciplined, worked with all sorts of people like Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, done all sorts of jobs, managed a massive hotel in Dallas. Last time I met Tim face to face was at the Dallas Speaking Conference, and Tim was a former president of the Texas Speaking Association. Of course, Texas is bigger than the UK, so we had 13 regions here, and one the size of Texas has all sorts of speakers. Tim, welcome. Now tell me, Tim, you told me that you were a hobo. As a Brit, I have no idea what that means.
Okay, well, it's great to be back here and great to be seeing my friends again here from the chat show. What a hobo is a person back from the post-Civil War era that jumps trains to get across the United States. Now, hobo is actually a derivative of the term hoeing boy. Now, after the Civil War, which some of us call the period of general unpleasantness, there was a lot of out-of-work people that were no longer required by the military. So these men could only find work as farm workers, because as the United States expanded westward, there was more farms and more farm work available. Now, there wasn't a lot of tractors or automated machinery there. Everything was done by hand. So these itinerant workers would be hoeing boys, and they would get to the west as the trains expanded westward. They would jump trains and they'd hide on the trains. They didn't actually used to have to hide. They were just riding there. Now, a hobo, that continued on. As a matter of fact, it still continues on. Now, there are 3 distinctions that I learned when I went with a hobo, and I'll have my origin story there in a second. There is a hobo who is always known to be a worker. And a hobo will do anything for food or money when it comes to work. I personally swept out a big distribution center for 2 hamburgers. Underneath the hobo, and less respected than the hobo, are called tramps. And tramps really just get on the trains and they don't do any work. They're typically lazy. You will often see them what hobos call, flying a sign. They'll stand on the side and it'll say, need money or will work, but they really don't mean it. They're looking for handouts. That's a tramp. And then there's a bum. And a bum is typically more dangerous because they usually are drug users. They don't do anything and they can cause trouble. So, but a hobo is an honest worker. And the way I got into it was I had a friend from college who was a genius. He said his IQ was like 185. I have no doubt about it. But he's a very, very unusual person, is a gifted athlete. He played racquetball. He was actually world champion. And in order to get to racquetball tournaments, because they only offered very small money at the time, he would jump trains and he would get into the town where there was a tournament. He became very good at that and he adopted that lifestyle full time. He came through Dallas 7 years ago. He contacted me on Facebook and he said, haven't caught up in 40 years, you want to get together? I did. We had him as a guest in our house, and one day he looked at me and he said, You want to go jump a freight? Well, now I'm going to leave that story for a second and go back to another story that explains the reason why I said yes. When I was 6 or 7 years old, I noticed that I did not have something that all of my friends had. As a matter of fact, most of my friends had two. I had none, and I wasn't ever going to have one. And that what that was a grandfather. Both of my grandfathers were out of the picture. One deceased and one abandoned my family and returned to Canada, abandoned my mother, my two uncles, and my grandmother, and went back there. Went back to Canada after he got fired by Henry Ford because of an industrial accident that caused him to lose his eyesight. Anyway, not having a grandfather really, really impacted me. But I did have an uncle that was always around, and he was a great guy, and he had a very deep voice, and he wore super white shirts, super starch, very starch. And he had wire rim glasses, but he was very kind to me. So I enlisted him to be my grandfather. I never told him that, but he became my grandfather figure. And the one thing that he did, again, around age 7, is he gave me this, him and my Aunt Grace. Now that only looks like an old book. It is an old book. It was printed in 1954, but that book changed my life. When he first gave it to me, I was very disappointed that it wasn't a toy. I go, it's a book. I can't read very well. It's a book. Well, when I was completely bored one time, I started to pick it up, and it's a book about animals. It's a book about stories of grandpas and grandparents. So anyway, he became my mentor. And one time I made this scrapbook, newspaper clippings of my heroes in sports, baseball, ice hockey, all of that. And I showed it to him because I wanted to impress him. He's my grandfather, right? Grandfather figure. Mm-hmm. And he was very unimpressed. And I turned page after page and I said, Uncle Mac, isn't this cool? And he goes, well, those are stories about other people. Timmy, I'm only interested in what you've done. You need to make a scrapbook of your life. How many pages can you put on your life? And I thought about that, and I go, and then he said something that sticks with me today. He said, you can never benefit from experiences you're not having. So my friend Bo says, you want to go jump a freight? So I said, I've never done that. I've never been around hobos, but I'd like to do that. So we went to Fort Worth, and I learned how to jump freights safely. But most importantly, I got to go to a hobo camp, which there's always a hobo camp. They call it a hobo jungle, but it's not much of a jungle because there's a guy there that's at the entrance, and it can't be seen very easily. You have to search for it, but there's always, where there's big train changing stations, there's always a hobo jungle. He's at the front door. He's the doorkeeper, and he makes sure that no bums get in. He makes sure no bad people get in. And he's sitting there on his California blanket, or it's also called 1,000-mile paper. And what it is corrugated cardboard, because corrugated cardboard is what you want to lay on. And it also something you want to put in your clothing because it's incredibly well insulated. So he's sitting there on his cardboard, and he nods to my friend, who he knows is a real hobo. And then he looks at me and he goes, hey, Flintstone. And I said, hey. And there's a whole language that hobos speak. What a Flintstone is actually a phobo, F-A-U-X, bo. It's a phony hobo. A Flintstone is a person that acts like a hobo with an American Express card in his pocket. And that was actually me. And so I watched and I stayed in the camp, and then we went to look for a train, and we walked the grit, which is the side of the rails, on either side of the rails. You walk the grit until you find a car that you want to get into. You don't jump into a car because the wheels are 3 feet or 1 meter high. And even in a box car, the boxcar comes up to just underneath my chin. So you need to really be pretty strong to get into a boxcar, which you don't want to do in Texas, because if the door closes, you're done. It's enough.
Tim, can I just hold you there a minute just
Sure.
to clarify a couple of points?
Sure.
These trains you're talking about, of course, are freight trains. We don't have a lot of freight trains in the UK. They're mainly
Right.
commuter trains or trains that take you all over the country. They go incredibly fast. So
Yep.
how do you jump a freight train that's moving at 20 miles an hour, or isn't it?
You absolutely don't. You never, rule number one in hobos, never leave a train that's moving. Never try to get on one that's moving unless it's an absolute emergency. Okay. The other real danger is when they're in the switching yards. We have huge switching yards where they make trains. Like if they're going to Denver, if they're going to New York, if they're going to Los Angeles, at night, they push the cars around with these little engines, and they create these long trains. Well, you never want to be in a freight yard in the dark, because those big cars are as big as homes, big as houses, actually, almost, and they roll silently. You will get clipped by one of those, and that's called greasing the rails.
I've heard, yeah. And another question. I mean, in the UK, we call them freight trains or freight yards or goods yards. And you couldn't get into those. They would have, 12-foot fences, lights around them. Presumably, it's not as secure as that in the US.
Oh, they have the same thing in the US, but there's a hole. My buddy Bo says, Doc, he goes, let's find the hole in the fence. I said, how do you know there's a hole in the fence? He said, there's always a hole in the fence, and there's always a hole in the fence, and you can get in. But you want to be away from the freight train, the freight cops. They're called bulls, and they're typically very mean. But there's, anyway, in the hobo jungle, I did meet somebody who was a Stanford PhD in anthropology. And she knew my friend Doc, she knew of him, so they got along famously well. And oh yeah, she funded her education and her tours as a hobo by being a Victoria's Secret model. And she'd been on television, she's a supermodel, and super unpleasant. Well, I hope that doesn't go in the recording, but anyway, she was very nice to some people, but didn't have anything to say to me. And so that was one of the experiences. But I'd like to transition from hobos to talk about something that I think is very important for our times. And I want to say that stories about Tim Durkin aren't really interesting. What my stories are designed to do is to illustrate some universal values and principles that I believe are important right now. Now, I have had great mentors in my life. Stephen Covey was one. Mike Vance, who was Walt Disney's protege, was the other. I learned so much from them. But the people that I learned perhaps the most from, one of them cleaned toilets for a living. The other one murdered 2 people, and I met him in jail. And then the third one was a homeless person that gave me a gift that I will give to this group. And I encourage you to test it 1 or 2 times and to see if you have the same reaction that I do, because it literally shocks people. So which one do you want to hear about? The toilet cleaner, the murderer, or the homeless man?
Well, take them in that order, please, Tim. That would be
briefly, I ran the Dallas Market Center, and I had a lot of people that worked for me. I had 850 hourly employees. We were going to do an improved customer service training course, and I wanted to learn about what kind of training had already happened, because we were getting complaints that our people weren't nice, and customer service training was all the deal. And I had my Disney mentor. I learned all about the Disney process. And so I said, who's the best? And they said, that's Brownie. I said, who's Brownie? They said, Brownie cleans the toilets on the first floor of the World Trade Center, which we have a building called the World Trade Center in Dallas. And I go, really? And they go, yeah. So he said, just watch him. So I went down there during market. 40,000 people are at market. These are the market centers where people who own stores can buy goods for their stores. It's a collection of 4,000 wholesalers and distributors and in the various showrooms. So I'm watching this guy named Brownie, and he's a short little guy, unknown age. He had short cropped hair, and he was greeting everybody by name and saying, oh, he's reading their badge. Oh, there's Derek Arden from London, Big Ben, what a thing, unbelievable. And there's so-and-so from New York City, the city that never sleeps, the Big Apple. Chicago, my kind of town, Chicago. And he's greeting everybody. And then people are shaking his hand, and his hand immediately goes into his pocket. So I know he's accepting tips. I got no problem with that. I have no problem with that. Anyways, afterwards, I came up to him and I said, Brownie, my name's Tim Durkin. He goes, I know who you are. You're one of the big people on the 5th floor. I said, I'm no bigger than you, partner. I just wanted to thank you and say you're doing an outstanding job. But I do have one question, Brownie. How is it that you know all of these places? How do you have time to work for us if you're in New York and London and Shreveport and Chicago and all of that? He said, well, Mr. Durkin, he said, I don't think I've ever been outside of the county of Dallas. I said, really? Well, you act like you did. He said, well, I read a lot. And he said, besides, Mr. Durkin, he said, everybody likes to know, everybody likes to hear kind words about where they're from. And I said, yeah, they do. He said, kind of puts them in a good mood, if you mean. I said, well, how can you stay in such a good mood? And I said, by the way, Mr. Brown, you can't call me Mr. Durkin. We're on a first name basis. He said, well, you can't call me Mr. Brown, sir, because I wouldn't answer to Mr. Brown. I've been Brownie all my life. It's just Brownie's fine with me. I said, Brownie's fine with you. Tim is fine with me. He hitched his pants, took a different stance, stuck out his hand and said, you got a deal, Mr. Tim. And I said, okay, how come it is that you're so happy when your job is cleaning toilets and urinals? He said, well, Mr. Tim, I don't look at it like that. He said, what I do is I create a pleasant environment for an occasionally necessary experience.
Wow.
Okay, that's fantastic. And I said, well, what do you do when you're not doing, not doing this? You keep your place spotlessly clean. Everything is, he said, well, I look for the answers. I said, you look for the answers, do you find them? He said, every time. Every time I got a question, I find an answer. I said, could you tell me where you go to find the answer? And he said, well, Mr. Tim, and he had his cart, and he took off about 10 white clean towels, and underneath that was a towel that wasn't one of our white towels. It was obviously his. It was obviously old. He took that, and inside he unwrapped something, and it was the oldest Bible I ever saw in my life. And he said, they're all in here. Any question you got, they're all in here. I said, wow, that's great to know. Yeah, I said, I'm very honored to have somebody like you working for me and working for us. And he said, Mr. Tim, may I just correct you? He said, I know that the chart says that I work for you, but he said, I really work for him. Everything I do glorifies him. And I said, well, that's a good thing. He said, well, Mr. Tim, I've enjoyed talking to, oh, by the way, Mr. Tim, I'd like a promotion. What's your title? You're one of those C people, aren't you? I said, yeah, well, yeah, I'm the COO, Chief Operating Officer. And he goes, okay. He said, Mr. Tim, I need you to make me promoted to the CSO. And I said, CSO, I've heard of CFO, CEO, COO. What's a CSO? He said, I want to be your Chief Smile Officer. Because if I don't see somebody with a smile, I give them one of mine. And he had a big gold tooth right there. Now, the thing was that I knew I was speaking to wisdom. And I was smart enough to go down there when I had a dilemma that I was facing. And I would say, Brownie, would you walk with me? And he said, yes, sir, Mr. Tim, what's on your heart? And I said, Brownie, I got a couple of decisions to make. And if I make one way, it's going to please some people. If I make another way, it's going to, I just want to be fair and stuff like that. He said, what's your head tell you should do? I said, well, my head tells me that I should do this. He said, what's your heart tell you should do? I said, well, my heart tells me go the other direction. He said, which will make a better pillow? And it was always answered like that. This man was Yoda, and he would be discounted in any other environment. I want to say from the beginning that the best lesson I learned in life was that there were people who are very kind, very compassionate, very helpful, and they didn't look anything like me. And there were people who were mean and nasty, and in some cases evil, and they looked just like me. And what I learned very early is that you can't judge a book by its cover, as we like to say. It's a case of getting to know goodness, because goodness resides everywhere. And that was very, very key. Very key. So Brownie, he showed me a picture of his wife, and it fell out of his Bible. It's his bookmark. And I said, oh, that's a beautiful woman. And it was. He said, yep, that's her. That's the one. That's her name is May, like the month, but with an E, not a Y. And I said, well, that's something to go home to. He said, oh, Mr. Tim, she'd been gone 12 years. And I miss her still. And it was just, it was unbelievable. Every encounter with him, I felt better. And he was one of our lowest paid employees. So you want to go to the murderer, or you want to go to the homeless person?
You want to go to the murderer, but I got to say that was a fantastic story, and I see you living the dream of the story as you went through it, as you were telling it with total authenticity. So thanks for that, Tim.
Well, you're welcome. That's the condensed version. I got plenty of Brownie stories. I'm telling you, this man was Yoda. I once lived in Virginia near Washington, D.C., and one of my neighbors, a neighbor couple, joined somebody named Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson was in the Nixon administration. He was one of the architects of the Watergate break-in and a lot of other nefarious things that happened in that administration. He went to prison and had a very deep, profound Christian experience, especially as it relates to the treatment of prisoners, especially after they get released. So he started something called the Prison Fellowship. It was in large part based on Christianity. My neighbors invited me over to join, to find out more about it. And when I was in their house, I could not tell the prisoners from the good people, except by a couple of tattooed cases. But I then got involved in working with prisoners, and we could talk about the Bible if they wanted to. I hope they didn't, because I'm not really well versed in the Bible. But nonetheless, they said, just sit with the people, talk with them, find out what they want. Well, the very first time I went into a jail, the jailers did not like the fact that the Christian do-gooders were coming in there. And I'll never forget, they walked me down to this guy's office, this guy's cell, who had requested a prison fellowship person. And the guy said to me, he said, okay, you're in here. And he slammed the door behind me. And he said, if you get in trouble or need any help, just yell. We'll hear you and we'll get here as quick as we can. The room was completely dark. All I saw was the bottom of a pair of shoes, Converse All-Stars. And then I heard a voice from in the darkness laying on the cot and said, are you the teach? And I squeaked, yeah, I am. And he said, take a seat. Well, the only place to sit down was the stainless steel commode with a wash basin behind it. So I went to sit on that, and he started laughing. He said, I'm only kidding you, but that wasn't his exact words. Anyway, his name, he said, was Jim, and we talked for a long time, and we got to know each other. And he said, I said, what would you like from our visit? He said, can you prepare me for the high school equivalency test? In the States, we call it the GED. And I said, sure. What do you want to study? I want to study English, reading, math. He said, I want to know long division. Can you teach me long division? I said, yeah, I can teach you long division. No problem at all. Why do you want to learn long division? He said, well, I'll tell you. He said, when I grew up, I couldn't wait to get out of the house and get to school. He said, I'd run down our lane. It was 2 miles to the school. I'd run all the way. He's 5 or 6 years old. He's going to kindergarten in a schoolhouse in rural Virginia. And he's running down there and running down there. and he couldn't wait because he wanted a front row seat in his classroom. He absolutely wanted to be in the front row seat, and every single day he got one. He used to cut across this big farm in Virginia, and the farmer on the tractor one time stopped him and yelled, "Hey, boy, what are you doing running across my field?" He said, "I'm sorry, Farmer Smith." He said, "I'm trying to get to school. I got to be the first one so I can get a front row seat." And the farmer looked at him cockeyed and said, "That true, boy?" He said, "Yes, sir, I love school." He said, "Boy," he said, "tomorrow I want you to swing by the house." He said, "I want you to go past the back porch. There'll be something on the back porch there. Whatever's on the back porch is yours, son. You understand?" He said, "Yes, sir." He didn't know what the heck was happening. Next morning, he runs across there. Farmer waves to him. He gets to the back porch and he finds a plate with hot biscuits, honey, and a big glass of cold milk. He scoops that down there, and then sometimes it was a peanut butter sandwich or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He'd pick it up and he'd run every single day. Sometime the people, after about a year of this, he didn't come anymore. And the farmers were concerned, so they went to the community. It's a community living in the woods, ex-former slaves or descendants of former slaves. And they were looking, they said, "We're looking for James. We want to find James." He says, "James lives down there." They knocked on the door. Now, this is two people of means who drove in a car. They're knocking on the door, and they said, the woman answered, and she said, "What you want?" She said, "We'd like to know, is this where James lives?" She said, "What you want with my boy?" She said, "Well," she said, "we really like James, and we're really happy, and we put out a little bit of biscuit for him every morning. We haven't seen him." And she said, "Well, what's going on?" James stopped showing up. Well, the net of the story was that in the 3rd grade, he got a new teacher. He's in the front row. The teacher announces, "Boys and girls, we're going to study long division. But James, you're too stupid to learn long division. I need you to pick up your stuff and move to the back of the room so you won't be a distraction." And from that moment on, every other kid called him Stupid James. Stupid James, Stupid James. Notice I said when I met him, his name was Jim. And I sat there and I said, "Well, that's unbelievable." So he's a big baseball fan, coached 3 Little League teams, and worked in the lumber yard. And I said, "Well, long division, that's baseball average. You coach 3 teams. When your players ask you what their batting average is, what do you tell them?" I said, "Well, that's 400, 350, so and so." I said, "Well, how did you figure that out?" He said, "I didn't figure it out. I made that shite up." I said, "Oh, well, it's long division." So we got the newspaper out. I showed him the baseball averages from the Sunday paper, and we started doing long division. And I'll never forget the one time that he got the right answer. We did the multiplication, the short division, the long division. He got the right answer, and every time he did it, he'd poke with the decimal point. He'd go, bam, that's a signal that he's done. And then I'd look in the newspaper, and I'd name the player, name the number of times they batted, name the number of times they got a hit, and it would give the average. And I showed him the average, and the very first time that the average in the newspaper was the average that he figured out, he got really quiet. And he said, "Let's do another." So I read the second player, and I read the number of times at bat and all of that. And he's figuring it out, and a huge drop of water hits the paper. And then another one hits the paper. And now I am in an emotional wreck with a 2-time murderer. And I never felt safer in my life. And I probably never was safer in my whole life. He said it's his allergies. The next week I came, there are 535 baseball players in the major leagues. He had folded the paper and figured out the long division average of every single paper and had a stack of, he had a stack of pages like this. I don't know if Carl remembers the Big Chief tablet. Okay, this is what they give you in kindergarten or something. He had a stack of them. I corrected them. That was the whole time. I corrected him. And then he said, I said, we got some right, but you got almost all of them right, but you got some wrong. He said, what's my grade? What's my letter? And so we went back again. It was 91. I said, you got an A. He goes, I got an A. And he jumped up and I jumped up and I went for the high five. He went for the hug and he hugged me and he's carrying me around. Now, this man is very much like a gorilla. He is extremely strong. He would curl 225 pounds. I don't know what that is in stone or kilo, but he would be doing that like it was nothing. And he put me in the hug and he's carrying me around dancing. I got an A in long division. I got an A in long division. And then he did an expletive to that teacher. He did serve time. It was he killed his girlfriend and the boy, a man that she was seeing, and he did serve 20 some years. He came out. He was hired back immediately. He was beloved in his community, absolutely beloved before. Lumberyard hired him back. You could go there, you could ask for Jim and say, Jim, I've got a project. I want to build a deck on my house. I want it to be 12 by 14 or 3 meters by 4 meters or whatever. And he'd ask questions, well, do you want to use 2x4s, 2x6s, whatever? And in his head, he'd say, you need 125 of these, you need 12 of these, you need these. He'd do it all in his head because for 26 years, he did long division. This is the finest, one of the finest human beings I ever met, had a very, very bad moment. I won't explain how he explained that away, but he was good. He was, I would trust him with my children, my grandchildren. If he'd have gotten out, I would have hired him as a guardian for our kids. Some people say that's naive, but I know goodness, and goodness was in that jail cell. And goodness was in other jail cells. But believe me, there is evil in prisons too, evil.
Tim, that's a great story. That's a great story. And I think we've all come across people being told they were stupid at a very young age, and that is a total disgrace on all sorts of things by parents and all sorts of people. But let's discuss that later. Let's go on to story 3, because time's ticking by. Okay, and you said that was a homeless man dressed in rags and stinking to high heaven. Is that true?
Oh, well, I took my wife and I, you know, we like to do some things in the community and so on. And we had this opportunity through some friends of ours to do a breakfast, a pancake breakfast for the homeless people in Fort Worth, not far from where I jumped trains, by the way. So I knew there were plenty of homeless people there. And whenever there's free food or something good is happening, the homeless people seem to have this silent communication and they come like pigeons. Anyway, we are doing this. We wanted our grandson, who's 12 at the time, we wanted him to see, we didn't want to talk about doing good things. We wanted to do good things with him. And he's a little bit on the spectrum, meaning he's got a short attention span. And so, but he's a fabulous kid. So I said, Blake, you're in charge of, I'm doing the pancakes, cooking the pancakes. You are syrup and butter guy, okay? You ask them for syrup or butter, whatever they want, or both. He said, okay, so we're having a great time. People are coming up to us and they're very nice. And I had this greeting. I said, good morning, thank you for joining us. How's your day today? And so, you know, the people are coming here. We gave them as many pancakes as they wanted. They also got a free loaf of bread and all that. We were almost done. And this guy comes up, and I swear at 4 meters, I could smell him. I mean, he was really, really bad. He had a top coat or an overcoat on. One of the pockets was completely ripped out. It was literally in tatters, and his shoes were coming apart on his feet. And he kind of shuffled up to us. And he came up, and I said what I said to everybody else. I said, good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today? And he leaned forward like this and he goes, best day of my life. And I looked into a face that was an autobiography of years. hard years. And I said, really? What's making this the great day of your life? That's great. And he goes, well, I love pancakes. They're free. You're here, you and the boy, and you're nice. I said, okay. And he said, and sir, it's a choice. I go, it's a choice. He said, your day is your choice. And I go, wow, I'm stealing that. And he jumped back and he said, you can't steal my, and he yelled, you can't steal that from me. And I jumped. I instinctively covered Blake. All of the other volunteers jumped, like we got a violent one. And all the other homeless people I noticed didn't even flinch. They go, that's just him being him. And he said, you can't steal that. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I won't. He goes, I'm going to give it to you. It's my gift to you. I'm trading you for those pancakes. I said, how many extra pancakes do you want? How many you got? I said, until the batter runs through, they're all yours. So we cooked them up pancake. We actually gave him a jug of maple syrup. He put it in his good pocket, had a bag full of pancakes, and off he went. I said, you never get up on the wrong side of the bed, do you, sir? And he goes, there is no wrong side of the bed. Why would you blame an inanimate object for your bad day? So, as you know, I like to have fun with people. When I meet strangers, people helping us and all of that. And when I first got on here, I said one of my favorite responses when somebody said, you know, have a nice day. I said, what's the best thing that happened to you so far today? Well, about 2 years ago, I started, about the time this show started, I started saying this because it had just happened to me. When people ask me, you know, perfunctory, hey, how are you today? I'm fine, how are you? Best day of my life. Every single time, it causes a smile. Sometimes people have doubled up in laughter. Other people say, why? I said, well, here I am. Every day above the ground is a winner. And I meet you, and we're both going to have a good day. And it's just automatic. And they say, and then I say, and it's a choice, isn't it? And they go, yeah, it is. Hey, thanks for that. And I've had people thank me effusively. I've had people break out and smiles. Everybody smiles. And I actually did it in Ireland, and it worked there. But I think they thought I was a crazy Yank. I really do. Yeah, okay, crazy vacation in Ireland, you know, all of that. I don't think they took me as seriously. But what I would suggest is that when you have the opportunity and somebody says, hey, how are you doing today? You say I'm having the best day of my life, or it's the best day of my life. But say it just casually. Don't say, oh my God, it's the best day of my life. It's the best day of my life. Oh, why? It's a choice. And that's what I've chosen. Because every single human interaction gives us the opportunity to make the world a little better or a little worse. But the choice is ours. It's completely ours. And you can do something like that. It's like I nod to a stranger, and the stranger nods back. And two human beings go off, a little less anonymous. And I'm not virtue signaling here. I have used this best day of my life thing. Now, my wife is a little tired of it, I got to tell you. So I've toned it back when she's around. But I have so many stories of things that have happened post that interaction that it's not funny. I want to draw your attention, since you're in the UK, to an article that came out from the BBC on August the 3rd of this year. And it's called Citizen Future. And it's written by two people who are writing a book on the word citizen for the future. Because right now, we are moving towards authoritarianism or consumerism. We are either subjects or consumers, or in some cases, we're products. Okay, Facebook, we're a product. There's so much authoritarianism. And this isn't a political statement. It's just that we are being told by people who may or may not have the right information on what to do, and we're obeying it. We can't work together. And here's why. Our governments have failed us. Our political leaders have failed us. You could almost say it's not their fault, but here's why. Their position, their power, and their money comes from holding positions that are against each other. Like here we have the left and the liberals, and then we have the right and the conservatives. And you'd expect that somehow they come together, but they never do. Why? Because they're being paid not to. All right, their power is that they can't concede. And as soon as one of them did, like Dick Cheney's daughter, she was vilified and ostracized because she went over. Same thing with two of the senators here. So what we need to move to is individually. Our only hope is individual. Business won't help, government won't help, leaders won't help. We got to do it on our own. And we have to remember that the word citizen, the etymology of the word, means together people. So I suggest that we have to have interactions that make the world just a little bit better. And it's super simple to do. It's super simple to do. And I think I would end on that. It is, I can be softer than a flower, borrowing from the Buddha, or no, this is Yogananda. He said, you can be softer than a flower when it comes to kindness, but louder than the thunder when it comes to values. And I think that's just the way we do. We need to have the value of citizenry. And I think that article, that very recent article in the BBC is wonderful. So it's up to us. It literally is up to us individually. And we got to make the world a better place.
Tim, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I've got 4 pages of notes. As everybody knows, I am a serial note taker because the notes go into your brain and you don't forget them when you do. I'm going to just list a few things there.
Say Nancy. Bye-bye, Nancy.
That I picked up. Super white shirts. It's interesting how super white shirts give authority to situations. I noticed that Americans generally always wore a super white shirt and they were believed because of it. That was your grandfather figure. You can never benefit from experiences you haven't heard. I've heard you say that before, but I've forgotten it. As we do, we generally do forget things we heard the first time. Chief Smile Officer. Wow, that's great. I love that. Brownie, what a top man he was, clearly.
Oh, what a figure.
And of course, that's wisdom. Wisdom's something you learn, don't you, when it comes.
And you know what? I doubt that he had 3 years of formal education. It was he grew up in a very tough time in a very tough city for African American. And but one of the most beautiful people ever, and beloved by the entire organization because he exuded. We are contagious. People are contagious. We have to think about that. We're way more contagious than COVID. You ever been in a room full of people and there's one grumpy? It's just remember you're a virus. You carry a virus. It could be a good virus or it could be a bad virus.
2 things I want to mention there. Language is just so important and people don't really get that. You've talked about best day of my life, but that teacher telling James, whatever his name was, you're too stupid to learn. Think about a language, stupid compared with fantastic. You don't understand this yet, but I'm gonna help you. I know that you and I are passionate. That's how we first formed our friendship 16 years ago, by talking about these things. 2 lonely men in a bar, weren't we? Actually,
we were in a beach bar too. We were
in a beach bar. Introvert. I've heard you say best day of my life before. I'd forgotten it. It is a choice, and I'm going to try that out on a few people. And I'll be curious if other people on this call would try it if they've got the nerve. It took me a while to say I'm fantastic every day when I learned that. It works and it causes people to smile. It changes their state. So I'd like to hear from anybody who does that. I'll try it tomorrow. You have to pluck up the courage the first time generally, but watch their reaction to it. Watch the emotional intelligence in their face, and you can pick up.
I'd be very interested to know if it transports to the United Kingdom, you know, the English stiff upper lip sort of thing. I really would like to know. It would be interesting. And you just lay it out there, how best day of my life. Really, why?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are contagious, and you can change people's mood, their state, can't you, by doing it? Smiling, good morning, people tend to answer back. And finally, Tim, you are a crazy Yank, but that's why we'll invite you back all the time. So thank you for that. Will you stay on for a bit and share a few?
Of course.
Bits more wisdom? Can I ask everybody from Monday Night Live to give Tim the usual vote of thanks in the Monday Night Live?
Thank you.
That was brilliant, Tim. Please come and back and join us. Are all these tips in this book, Points of Impact, which you wrote in COVID a couple of years ago, to make a difference to people? Or as Nigel Kirby says, are they going to be in your next book?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Look, Michael O'Hara's holding up one of your books. Hold it up again, Michael. I'm not the only one that's...
there you go. Thank you.
Got
Thank
it
you.
on there. Tim Durkin.
Yeah, I am going to do another book, but I'm thinking about, most of my kids don't even know these stories. I do know Blake. Blake will never be the same after that. Not only, well, Blake was an added, he's a bonus kid because of how he came into our family. But boy, he and I are so close, it's unbelievable. And I actually put it to that situation.
Tim Durkin, thanks for joining us. I hope you'll join us again. I know you'll join us every week as a guest, but as a guest speaker. That was absolutely brilliant. Thanks for joining us. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like it. Follow timdurkin.com with his stories. A great storyteller and brilliantly told. Thanks, Tim.